From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So I'm Pam Jackson. I'm director for the Center for the Book here at the Library of Congress, and I'd like to welcome you to our Books and Beyond series this afternoon. It is our final one of this season, so we're thrilled, very thrilled with the special conversation we have for you today to complete our season and to thank you guys for being here. You know, at the Library of Congress, we are America's first cultural institution. And with that, we live inside our mission, and it's to provide a rich and enduring source of knowledge, one that's designed and intended for people to create, to endeavor intellectually, to prosper and thrive. And it's a very awesome opportunity to live inside that mission. And at the Center for the Book, which includes the Poetry and Literature Center, we promote books and libraries, reading and literacy, and poetry and literature. And we do so knowing that they are very significant components of having an informed and engaged society. And that is the Center for the Book's mission. And in fulfilling that, we have talks like we have today. Today's talk is a culmination of a couple of things that really matter to the library. First and foremost, it's scholarship. We care a lot about people knowing what the collections are here at the Library of Congress and that they can be used, that they can be researched, that they can be engaged with for the purpose of a variety of reasons, including scholarship, publishing, and celebrating books as part of what the Books and Beyond series does. So today's event is a very special one with a special author because it's not just about research that was conducted here at the Library of Congress, which we encourage and invite people to do, but it's also a result of a Library of Congress employee, and a very special one at that. So I should mention a couple things before I introduce her, one of which is to give us a moment now to avoid unnecessary distraction. Take another distraction. Check on your devices. Make sure you're on silent, if you would, please. And that's also because we are recording today's event. And should you participate in the question and answer period that does follow the author's talk, you'll be recorded on our webcast. And so we do invite you to participate knowing that. And we encourage you to visit us at read.gov, where you can find more than 250 author talks of a variety and diversity of topics and individuals who have been with us in this program. So today's author. Oh, and the book is for sale. So here in the back of the room, make sure that you stop by that table and make your purchase, and there'll be an opportunity for signing after. Now, so today's author, the chief criterion for the Books and Beyond series, as I mentioned, is we really want to feature books that are related to the Library of Congress. Primarily, we focus on those that are published as a result of research conducted here at the Library of Congress. But more significantly today, we have an author and a scholar who is an employee of the Library of Congress, who is a long-serving and dedicated and special employee. And I've had the pleasure of knowing you for a bit and experiencing your scholarship. There are two other major Library of Congress reference works that Peggy Wagner has produced, one of which is the Library of Congress Civil War Desk Reference, and also the Library of Congress World War II Companion. She's also the author of 5 other books, including Maxfield Parrish and the Illustrators of the Golden Age, and the Library of Congress Illustrated Timeline of the Civil War. Peggy, as a is a part of our publishing. She is a publisher and editor with us here at the Library of Congress, and she's going to talk to us today about America and the Great War, a Library of Congress illustrated history. And it's a very, very marvelous piece. If you hadn't had a chance to see it or read it, it is fabulous. It's both inspiring, it's candid and kind of straight talk, and also very inspiring. I feel like I was there at that time as a result of your writing. So I honor you and appreciate you, and let us all bring honor and acknowledge Peggy Wagner as she comes to the stage.
Thank you, Pam. Let's see if I can see over the microphone. Can you hear me? Okay. And thank you all for coming to hear me talk a little bit about America and the Great War, the book and the era that it describes. As anyone who has known me or who has been with me for more than 5 minutes over the past 5 or 6 years knows, this era is one that I find incredibly intriguing. And I also feel that it's one of the most important eras to understand. It's important not just for the understanding of general world history, but it's also important to understand American history. It's also an era for which the Library of Congress collections are amazingly, almost mind-bogglingly rich. I am the author of the book, yes, but I consider this volume an epic collaboration, something that you will find reflected in the 2 pages of acknowledgments at the back of the book. You'll find the names there of many of the Library of Congress specialists and curators who served as my professors and guide as in this long enterprise of creating the book. Several of you are sitting here in this room, and I thank you all. I would also like to salute the most talented picture editor with whom I've worked on a number of projects. Pardon me, I'm having a frog in my throat perpetually these days. Athena Angelos, who is sitting right here. And I would like to salute especially, before we go to war, my colleagues in the publishing office, who have helped me and supported me through many projects. Amy Hess, Peter Devereaux, and Susan Rayburn took time away from their own projects to read and comment on the text. Susan wrote the battle boxes that are a part of the book, and she also collaborated with staff around the library to produce the appendix at the end of the book on World War I collections in the Library of Congress that I feel is a great resource for everyone who consults the book. I'd also like to thank the new director of publishing, well, not new anymore, Becky Clark, who has been very supportive, gracious, and good-humored throughout this project. So, America and the Great War. This is a huge topic, and the book explores military history, political and social history, and it intertwines them. It is, if you will, a tapestry of stories within stories. This makes it very complicated. So what I thought I'd do today was present as many of the images from the book as I could possibly cram onto slides, and there are many of them, and then just try and sort of hopscotch through the book and describe to you some of the points it makes, some of the questions it addresses. And so we go to war. If you go to today, to what was 100 years ago, the Western Front, on which almost all, but not all, of American expeditionary forces served, you will find many artifacts and scars from 100 years ago. You'll also find many cemeteries, all large and small, all perfectly preserved. In France, you'll find many memorials and 9 cemeteries devoted to the commemoration of the brief but very important American military involvement in the war. But the United States was affected itself affected the war from 1914 to well after the armistice. And this book looks at that entire experience. The prologue describes the United States in the 2 years leading up to the war, the election of Woodrow Wilson, and the prevalent belief among European and American progressives, including Wilson's Secretary of State, William J. Bryan, that the era of major military conflict was over, that arbitration of international disputes was the wave of the present time and the wave of the future. It was the apex of the progressive era, and the prologue introduces the major domestic problems that the nation will continue to confront, argue over, and attempt to ameliorate through the war years and well beyond. One of the major problem areas, as represented here, was labor relations. Another, which many white progressives, including President Wilson, preferred to ignore, was the country's troubled race relations. The portrait at the upper right is the outspoken civil rights activist William Monroe Trotter, the spokesman who so offended President Wilson that Wilson effectively banned him from the White House in 1914. Despite the nation's and Wilson's preferred concentration on domestic improvements, Americans could not avoid foreign relations concerns. The most immediate and pressing in spring 1914 was the ongoing revolution in Mexico, the southern neighbor in which more than 40,000 Americans lived, and Americans had significant financial holdings. Wilson dispatched U.S. troops to Veracruz in April. They were still there when papers reported the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie on June 28th. Similar political assassinations had happened in Europe before, without major international consequences. Few Americans, or Europeans for that matter, suspected these murders would be the small spark that would ignite full-scale European war. When the war came, it immediately affected the United States. Stock markets closed and remained closed for months. U.S. trade with Europe came to a temporary but tremendously costly halt. 130,000 Americans were stranded in Europe without access to funds or transportation home. And one of my favorite stories in this book is the rescue mission mounted by the United States government and private partners to bring those Americans home. 10,000 of the Americans, approximately, who were stranded over there were teachers. And the young gentleman at the middle of the cartoon is a student who's absolutely delighted that school is going to be delayed. What's so bad about this war, he's saying. The U.S. thought, and people all around the world thought, everything was bad about the war. The United States instantly declared its neutrality, and President Wilson would soon embark on a quest to guide the warring nations to the conference table to find a negotiated settlement for the war. In October 1914, a dent in perfect U.S. neutrality occurs when the Wilson administration allows private U.S. banks to provide substantial loans to belligerent countries in the event most of the money wound up going to the Allies, but some did go to Germany in the beginning. Those monies would flow back into the American coffers in the form of orders for war materiel, and those orders would help end the recession and put the entire country in the black. The book traces the beginning and progress of an absolutely unprecedented outpouring of American aid to war victims, initially on both sides of the conflict. And it touches on the experiences of some of the American men who flouted U.S. neutrality to join belligerent forces. Almost all of them, although I have found at least 2 who didn't, but almost all of them serving in the Allied armed forces. For the conflict, at least for Americans, was beginning to shape up as a contest between militarism, autocracy, evil, and democracy, enlightened democracy. By the end of 1914, expectations for a short war were dashed. There are always, by the way, expectations that a war will be short, and they're almost never fulfilled. The land war became an industrial age nightmare that introduced a host of new and supposedly improved weapons. It was the maritime aspect of the conflict, however, that most immediately concerned Americans. The Allied surface navy blockade of the Central Powers, which as it expanded, violated the accepted rules for naval blockading, was a near constant irritant, but an irritant generally offset by the incoming Allied war orders. The U-boat counterblockade on which the Germans embarked in February 1915, and for which there were no governing rules of war, put American lives and property in great peril. The first major crisis came when 123 Americans were among the 1,198 people who died when a U-boat sank the British liner Lusitania without warning in May 1915. From then until April 1917, President Wilson, still determined to bring both sides to the negotiating table and keep America out of the war, walked a challenging diplomatic tightrope, so well illustrated here, while facing increased political pressures at home. The American peace movement remained very strong. The preparedness movement, primarily concerned with national defense rather than intervention, was growing. This is one of my favorite slides because of that caricature of Kaiser Bill at the center. It's by a French artist that I know only as Wheel, and it's from the Willard Straight collection in the Prints and Photographs division. From first Germany, and soon thereafter Britain, produced huge amounts of propaganda during the war, much of it aimed at the United States. By late 1915, American papers began publishing verified details of German and Austro-Hungarian espionage in the United States, all sorts of espionage, from the relatively peaceful to placing bombs on ships bound for the Allies. Reports also confirmed that German agents were seeking to increase the turmoil in Mexico, to distract American attention and resources and lessen the possibility that the United States would join the Allies. To decrease Mexican turmoil, the Wilson administration in October 1915 turned away from supporting Pancho Villa, who at first had seemed the strongest candidate to bring peace, relative peace, to Mexico, and recognized the government of Venustiano Carranza. This, of course, infuriated Villa. And I should mention that George Verreck, who is pictured here, was a German-American editor who established a newspaper called The Fatherland as soon as the war began, and it turned out that the Fatherland was totally subsidized by the German government. David Lloyd George, at the upper left-hand corner, was a cabinet officer at this time, and it was at his instigation that the British government established what was known as Wellington House, which was their propaganda department, which the United States later Committee on Public Information would echo in many ways. And Wellington House had a very special department aimed directly at influencing American opinion. In 1916, in January, the American Review of Reviews burst forth with the following: "War for Europe is meaning devastation and death. For America, a bumper crop of new millionaires and a hectic hastening of prosperity revival. This was not an exaggeration, and 1916 would be another financially profitable year. But pressures from beyond U.S. borders were increasing. The U-boat dangers, which waned and waxed, and waned again in March, when for the second time the Germans pledged that their submarines would abide by the rules of surface warfare. They would not sink any merchant vessels without prior warning or without seeing passengers and crew to safety. This was restricted submarine warfare. That same month, Pancho Villa and his guerrilla band raided Columbus, New Mexico, murdering 17 Americans and infuriating their entire country. General John J. Pershing led several thousand troops into Mexico just a week or so later on a months-long punitive expedition that did not find Villa, but did increase tensions with the Carranza government and did demonstrate how ill-prepared the United States Army was for participation in any major conflict. Britain also incurred American anger when, despite U.S. pleas for mercy, it executed the leaders of the Easter Rising in Ireland in April 1916. And again, when the British government issued a blacklist of more than 80 American firms and individuals suspected of selling materials to the Central Powers. In Europe, the horrors of war seemed to be growing exponentially, with the battles of Verdun and the Somme, two long, bloody, destructive slugfests occurring in this year. Americans served in the Allied ranks during both battles. Poet Alan Seeger was killed during the Battle of the Somme, and Americans were also in the skies above these battles. 1916 saw the official debut of a discrete American flying unit serving in the French forces, the soon-to-be celebrated Lafayette Escadrille. At home, preparedness forces were gaining, now with the assistance of President Wilson, who said in one speech, "All the rest of the world is on fire, but our own house is not fireproof." The Naval Appropriations Act of 1916 called for a massive expansion of the U.S. Navy by 1925. The National Defense Act of the same year made some small improvements in the Army, increasing it to the tremendous number of 175,000, and made some improvements in the National Guard, including allowing the president for the first time to deploy National Guard troops overseas in case of an emergency. On May 27th, Wilson also announced a major shift in U.S. foreign policy, declaring the U.S. a full partner in international affairs. "We are participants whether we would or not in the life of the world," he said. "What affects mankind is inevitably our affair." While all this was happening, the American Union Against Militarism was touring American cities, making speeches against what they saw as the American march toward European-style militarism and eventual disaster. AUAM speakers were accompanied by a giant papier-mâché dinosaur named Jingo, which was, and I quote, "all armor plate, no brains." 1916 was also a presidential election year. Wilson versus former Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. And it became a very close race. Teddy Roosevelt, who had aspired to the nomination, did not get it, and he supported Hughes, whom he referred to privately, I trust, at the time, as the bearded iceberg. It was a close race, and not just because Wilson still refused to endorse a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage, which he did. Once reelected, Wilson turned again to diplomacy, first asking belligerent leaders to state their war aims and defending both sides when he mentioned in his note that from what both sides had been saying through the war, it seemed their war aims were exactly the same. And later, in January, in a speech that came to be known as the Peace Without Victory speech. In that oration, he asked whether this war was, quote, a struggle for a just and secure peace or only for a new balance of power, unquote. And he predicted, very accurately as it turns out, that if one side gained victory over the other, that would mean, quote, peace forced upon the loser, and it would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory upon which terms of peace would rest, not permanently, but only as upon quicksand. Neither side was in the mood for peace without victory at this time, and Germany had already decided to return forcefully to unrestricted submarine warfare. All belligerent and neutral ships encountered in wide swaths of the Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean Sea would be sunk without warning. On January 31st, Ambassador von Bernstorff informed Secretary of State Robert Lansing that this unrestricted warfare would begin the next morning. As insurance to protect themselves against the possibility that this would bring the United States into the war, the new foreign minister of Germany, Arthur Zimmermann, sent a coded telegram to Mexico, the soon-to-be infamous Zimmermann telegram, which promised Mexico a rewarding alliance should it join the war against the United States, should the United States declare war. The German announcement did move the U.S. to sever diplomatic relations on February 3rd, but it did not immediately push the nation into war. Many Americans were still devoted to the cause of peace, although opinion was definitely turning. America and the Great War examines the last few weeks of events and debates in Congress and among civilian organizations, some of which will divide over the question of war. It also reports on the celebrations in March when Tsar Nicholas of Russia, the only autocrat leading an allied nation and the only non-American on this slide, was deposed in favor of a liberal government that pledged to stay in the war. And the book traces the tricky U.S.-Russian relations thereafter. Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress and a dedicated pacifist, is among 56 members of Congress who voted against a declaration of war. She was also the only member of Congress who voted against the war declaration in World War II. Some of the organizations that were divided over the war question included the Socialists, headed by Eugene Debs, who remained a staunch anti-war person, while other Socialists decided to further their cause by supporting the war, and the women's suffrage movement, the more mainstream suffrage organizations also decided that war support would benefit their cause, and they were correct about that. But more radical people, like Alice Paul, continued to aim directly and immediately at women's suffrage. Alice Paul and Eugene V. Debs were jailed during the American War. W.E.B. Du Bois was a leading African-American voice for war support, believing that war support in this war, as had not happened when blacks fought in the Civil War and in the frontier and in the War of 1898. But in this great war, war support might help advance the cause of African American equality. There were differences of opinion. The book has a quote from A. Philip Randolph, who said, rather than winning the world for democracy, making the world safe for democracy, wouldn't it be better to make Georgia safe for the Negro? The book contemplates the many major questions raised by the declaration of war and, too far. Would it be necessary to send an army overseas? And that was not apparent immediately. Many people in government figured that naval support and financial support and building an army just to defend the United States would be enough. This turned out quickly not to be the case. How large an army would be needed, whether or not we went overseas or stayed home? How would it be raised? How would the war effort be funded? What roles should women play? How would U.S. forces coordinate with the larger and more experienced and more numerous Allied armed forces? It discusses the heated civilian debate over conscription and the determination to build and maintain a distinct American army rather than place U.S. recruits within Allied ranks. Now we get to questions of civil liberties, and I will take this moment to say that there is going to be a symposium on that question this afternoon at 2 o'clock in the Montpelier room. The book considers the pressing question regarding civil liberties. How much freedom of expression and freedom of information can be allowed even in a proud democracy during a time of crisis? And this is a question that democracies face over and over again. Figures in this debate include George Creel, named in April to head the newly formed Committee on Public Information, Postmaster General Albert Burleson, to whom the Espionage Act, passed in June 1917, gave wide powers to refuse to mail suspect material without definite criteria for what made material suspect, and peace activist and Wellesley College professor Emily Balch, who spoke against a broadly worded provision of the act that restricted freedom of speech. I should add that we've put the vigilantes placard there. The vigilantes were not actually vigilantes. They were an organization of writers and artists that devoted their talents to war support. But at this time, there was a great deal of vigilante societies that was often supported by the United States government. And the book delves into that quite deeply as well. America and the Great War also looks at the mobilization, expectations, and actualities. Overall, the American war effort was an astonishing success. An army of 128,000 grew to one of approximately 4 million, 2 million of whom were sent overseas. But there were epic problems for this nation inexperienced in doing anything like this so quickly. The problems existed in War Department organization, in manufacturing and distribution of supplies for the AEF, in transportation, in regulating resources. There were congressional investigations. Senator George Chamberlain, a member of the president's own political party, became one of the severest critics of war effort failures. We are still unprepared without a definite war program and still without trained men, he roared in a public speech in December 1917. He raised presidential hackles by suggesting the American war effort be directed by a war cabinet of 3 distinguished civilians of private ability. This did not happen, and gradually, though problems did not disappear, they were reduced to manageable size. In November 1917, a second Russian Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power, and the Bolsheviks declared an armistice that allowed Germany to transfer combat divisions to the Western Front. More were transferred after the Bolsheviks signed the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty in March 1918. By the third week in March, as U.S. forces still requiring training were slowly arriving but were not present in sufficient numbers to tip the scale, German forces outnumbered Allied troops on the Western Front by about 2-1. On March 21st, General Erich Ludendorff, not a very likable person, by the way, launched a massive 5-stage offensive, and the first big blow sent Allied troops, with some ill-prepared Americans in training mixed in, reeling backward dozens of miles. In the U.S., this frightening news sparked measures to get doughboys to Europe at a much faster pace, many with very little training. It also sparked an upsurge in vigilantism and questionable actions by combinations of local officials and so-called agents of vigilance societies. March saw the first so-called slacker raids, general detention of any man who wasn't carrying his draft registration card, to be held without recourse until it was determined that he wasn't a draft dodger. It's probable that the bad news from the Western Front also helped pass the Sedition Act in May, legislation so out of tune with American traditions of freedom of expression that it was repealed shortly after the war. America and the Great War tells of stateside military training and the further training doughboys needed once they got to France. It addresses the very different treatment accorded the nation's white and black soldiers, including the 2 black combat divisions, the 92nd, which served unhappily under U.S. command, and the understrength 93rd Division, which fought with distinction under French command. It tells of significant American battle action, including Seicheprey, Cantigny, Belleau Wood, Château-Thierry, the French-led Marne offensive, and the 2 major U.S.-led offensives, Saint-Mihiel in September 1918 and the 4-stage Meuse-Argonne offensive that lasted from late September to the end of the war. It provides glimpses of the experiences of individuals, some of whom, like future World War II Army Chief of Staff and post-World War II Secretary of State George Marshall, are familiar. Others are relatively unknown. General Pershing called the much-decorated Sam Woodfill the most outstanding U.S. soldier of the war. John Lang, whose papers are in the Veterans History Project, was one of 300 men of the U.S. 6th Engineers completely untrained in combat, who were caught in the first phase, the first wave of the March 1918 German offensive, and gamely joined with British units to fight their way out. Born in Scotland, Lang became an American citizen shortly after the war. The book also follows 4,000 U.S. troops to Archangel in the frozen north of Russia, and 9,000 U.S. troops to Vladivostok in Siberia. And it follows the newly formed U.S. Third Army into Germany after the November 11th armistice to begin occupation duties. The book follows the continuing and amazing war support effort at home and events that affected that effort, including the sudden appearance of U-boats just off the coast of the East Coast that briefly placed the Navy Department under siege from concerned citizens. In late August, the Spanish flu pandemic hit the United States in force, taking an estimated 500,000 American lives. before it abated. The book's epilogue describes the multiple questions and problems resulting from bringing to a rapid halt a war effort that was just beginning to hit its peak in efficiency and in emotional fervor. It goes abroad with Woodrow Wilson, the first sitting president to travel to Europe, and touches on the vast hopes and bitter disappointments that resulted from that journey. It describes post-war violence in the United States, as labor lost many of its wartime gains in the bloody, strike-torn year of 1919, and African American hopes that their support for the war would advance the cause of equality were dashed in a period of racial violence. Bolshevism replaced Prussianism as a prime target of vigilantism in the country, as the country went through its first Red Scare. The second would happen after the Second World War. On a more positive note, Congress finally did pass the 19th Amendment to the Constitution after it had languished for many months in the Senate. Its ratification on August 18, 1920, meant that after decades of struggle, American women had the constitutional right to vote. Women were among the voters who heeded Warren Harding's call for a return to normalcy that gained him the White House in 1920. By then, the United States, facing no discernible military threat, had reduced its army to 137,000 men. In other vastly significant ways, however, there could be no turning back. The United States had emerged from the war the world's leading economic and a premier political power, with demonstrated potential for projecting military might abroad. It had failed to join the League of Nations, but it was soon working unofficially with League committees to assure the continuing peace and stability that was so vital to U.S. interests. In 1921, the United States organized a successful 5-nation naval disarmament conference. Shortly thereafter, recognizing the country's new position in the world and the truth of Wilson's 1916 statement that we are participants, whether we would or not, in the life of the world, a number of prominent Americans formed the Council on Foreign Relations to be better prepared, as a council history notes, for significant responsibilities and decision-making in world affairs. As venerable American statesman Elihu Root, one of the council's founders, stated in 1922, "I suppose that the people of the United States have learned more about international relations within the past 8 years than they had learned in the preceding 80 years. They are, however, only at the beginning of the task." Thank you. I think we may have some time for questions if anyone has any, preferably ones that I can answer. Yes?
What surprised you most as you were doing your research?
Oh my. So many things surprised me. Individual people surprised me. I discovered many interesting characters. But I think the depth of of the effect of the war on America right from the very beginning surprised me. The First World War, as people who know me have heard me say ad infinitum, has been an interest of mine since I was a little girl, but it was mostly interest in what I considered the appallingly futile war effort that killed so many people uselessly. I did not really delve into the political or social history, and certainly not the way it affected the United States. So this was sort of a gradual and continuing surprise as to how deeply it reached into our society. Sir?
Could you talk about how your
Oh. Now there's a question.
You can answer.
Well, how much time do you have? I find Woodrow Wilson to be a very frustrating individual to understand. He is a person of deep and abiding ideals and religious faith. He is a product of his time and place. He was a Virginian who remembered the Civil War when he was a little boy. His ideals and his idealistic speech are very moving, but then he also could be a very small man. And I think in some ways his unwillingness to listen to criticism is what helped doom American participation in the League of Nations. Whether that would have helped the League survive, I don't know, but I believe it would have. So I feel more closely acquainted with Woodrow Wilson, or slightly more closely acquainted, but with each step of closer acquaintance, I feel more frustrated by the man. Sir.
One of the more surprising things I learned was the amount of industry and the trading that was going on before the U.S. involvement. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what specific commodities were being shipped over to the belligerents, and then the sort of delicate response of the U.S. government when the Allies expressed their frustration.
Well, even during the period of neutrality, because of the blockade, almost much of the American supply line was heading directly to Allied nations. Things that were regarded as contraband could be confiscated under the rules of blockading by the Allied navies. The British Navy basically controlled the Atlantic. There was an episode in the book, the Germans, and in real life, incidentally, where the Germans developed commerce submarines. They were huge submarines that could be packed with a lot of supplies. And only one of them made it to America. It came over here twice. It was the Deutschland. And it was a very happy occasion because it brought over, for both the Germans and the Americans, because it brought over dyestuffs that we had been getting exclusively from Germany. And our industries were suffering. And it took back, sailing under the blockade, it took back contraband materials. When some supplies did go to Germany and Austria, Hungary, I think most of those were considered relief supplies. I don't know if that sort of answers your question. Sir.
There seems to be a lot of vague considerations why we went to war, but I didn't find anything totally definite. And some people say that the most definite was the financial obligations of the British government to financial institutions in the United States. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah. That's a toughie. A lot of the people who still objected to the United States entry into the war, several of them like Robert La Follette, Eugene Debs, they objected to our entry because they felt it was for financial reasons, to increase our prosperity. I think it was a mixture of reasons. I think there was an emotional factor. I think many Americans, and Americans of that time were remarkably, many of them, idealistic. Many Americans really did see the war, especially once Russia lost the Tsar, as a fight of good against evil. A lot of this stemmed from Allied propaganda, some of it accurate and some of it not, about German atrocities. But a lot of it stemmed from German espionage in the United States and the U-boat wars. I think also that Woodrow Wilson led the country into war in part because he felt that that was the only way that America, and he, as the head of the United States, could influence a post-war peace. As a matter of fact, in February of 1917, he got a letter from David Lloyd George, with a tremendously flattering letter that said, we're not urging the United States to go to war for your military assistance or for your financial assistance, though those things are important, but to earn you, Woodrow Wilson, a seat at the table as the leader of a disinterested country, a country that has no interest in securing territory, a country not so warped by these years of war. It's a letter calculated to turn anyone's head. Whether it turned his head, I think that was the sort of thinking he had. He was very much an idealist, an infuriating idealist, but an idealist. Yes?
I loved in the exhibit, I loved all of the personal stories from individuals.
Yes.
And some of them say like veteran project.
Veterans History Project.
Now, how do you guys get those? Because I thought the Library of Congress was just, wasn't really for private citizens who have stuff in there.
Private citizens have a lot of stuff in here.
So do you guys donate their
Yes, and if you go to the Veterans History Project website, there's a whole instruction to tell you how to go about donating materials and how to interview veterans. But the library accepts donations all the time. I am not a curator, so I cannot speak to the rules of donations, but if you turn around and talk to the two women behind you, they could probably help you out. Anything? One more question. Yes?
Can you tell us a little more about the fighting in Eastern Europe and the impact of the war on the immigrant populations in the United States?
That is a huge question. I did concentrate on the war in the West, although I did follow our relations with Russia from right when we entered the war. The war in the East was particularly difficult and savage. It was particularly hard on the Russian nation, which lost territory. The war in the East helped tear the Austro-Hungarian Empire apart. As to the impact on immigrants in the United States, that varied so much. Some recent immigrants returned when they could to their home countries, whichever they might have happened to be. Many immigrants, many recent immigrants, many first-generation Americans fought on the Allied side in the American Army. There were, I can't remember the percentage right now of immigrant Americans that comprised the AEF. Many of them could not speak English, and there's a little anecdote in the book about a Polish-American officer visiting a training camp, and where there were a lot of recent Polish immigrants. And they had not gotten any of the training down pat because none of their training officers could speak any Polish, and they didn't understand any English. And episodes like that led to the development of training units with bilingual officers to train American soldiers, AEF soldiers, both in the language and also in the arts of war. That's a partial answer, but it's a big question. Okay, I think if there are no more questions, thank you again very much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.